Today on this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen, the dirty 30s in Saskatchewan, where poverty and dust and wind ruled, and it took a heavy toll on everybody. But it was also a time when people helped one another, and one such story of kindness shaped and changed hockey history in this country. Stay tuned. We have with us today Bill Waiser. He is an historian, an academic, author of more than 21 books, the chronicler in particular of Saskatchewan's story. But what intrigued me and got me started in reading all of his material is this, Gordy's Skate. This is an amazing story. Mr. Waiser, welcome. Thank you. And thank you for writing this.
Thank you. A pleasure to be with you today.
All right. Tell us a little bit about Gordy's Skate.
Well, it's my first children's book.
Yeah.
And I've dabbled in nonfiction for over 3 decades. And I'm a person who uses stories as springboards into larger stories or larger themes. And so I deal in stories, and I've done books in the 1930s, and I came across the Gordy story a few times. And I finally decided to take the plunge. I had try something different. And so I decided to do a children's book. It's a different kind of challenge because you're writing for a different audience.
Exactly.
You have fewer words, and every word has to have meaning. But I thought it would be a great story for young people today, a special story for young people today.
So Gordie Howe, who was born in Floral, Saskatchewan, but moved fairly quickly to Saskatoon. Yeah. We all know how this story ends. He becomes a hockey legend. But the route there, the path there was serendipitous, accidental.
It was very much so. And I'm glad you mentioned the Floral part, because a lot of sports commentators has Gordy skating on the sloughs of Floral. I know Gordy was great, but that was impossible because he left Floral for Saskatoon when he was only a few weeks old with his family. And they left because of the Depression. His dad, Ab Howe, was looking for work, and his mother, Catherine, they decided to start over again in Saskatoon. So they left the farm in Floral. They went to Saskatoon. Ab Howe was very fortunate. He got a job with the city, but they're still relatively poor because of the times. And Gordy loves hockey. He loves sports. But at the time, because of their relative poverty, he had no skates.
So then what happened? Because this is a story that I just love. We see it still today. People in our communities are very generous, but this is a powerful...
It is a powerful story.
The times. Yeah.
They're living on the west side of Saskatoon. One night, there's a knock at the door. It's a neighbor. Her husband's ill. She needs help. She wants to sell an old sack of belongings. And Mrs. Howe gives her some money for the old sack without even looking inside. That's the interesting thing. She wants to help, do what she can to help a neighbor. And Gordy and his sister, Edna, are there at the door that same evening with her mother, and her mother brings the sack in and dumps it up before the kids, and drops out of the sack an old pair of men's skates. Gordy grabs one and Edna grabs the other. And these are large old skates, and they try them on left foot, try them on right foot. They're too big. They stuff newspapers down them. And they both try and skate on one skate. They try skating almost like a ballerina on one foot. They try skating with one hand. Gordy tries playing hockey on one skate with all of his other friends. And it's a very frustrating exercise. Edna eventually gets tired of trying to skate on one skate and abandons it. And Gordy snatches it. He takes it. Now he has 2 skates, and he never wants to take them off. There are stories of Mrs. Howe putting down newspapers in their home so that Gordy could come in for a meal with his skates still on.
Never take them off.
That's right. On the west side of Saskatoon, there used to be a large slough that went from the west side of Saskatoon all the way to the present-day airport. It was called the Hudson Bay Slough, and Gordy would skate that in the winter, practicing his moves, practicing his stick handling, et cetera, et cetera. But It's because of Mrs. Howe's kindness that Gordy got his first pair of skates and never looked back.
It is an incredible story, and the illustrations are quite lovely of the news, the two kids trying on
Right.
one skate each, or Mrs. Howe putting down the newspaper so he could come in. But I mean, it's so powerful because it's a true story.
Yes, it's a true story. The illustrator Leanne Franson, she lives north of Saskatoon. She's
Yeah.
done many children's books before, but it was great working with her. I sent her archival photographs of the west side of Saskatoon, what it was like in the 1930s. She worked from those photos. We worked back and forth on the text in terms of how to capture something in an image. We worked on getting Howe shot right. He shot right, or he was right-handed shot. Leanne had him shooting left-handed at first, so the little details like that we had to massage. But she did a great job. She really makes that story pop come alive. And I tried to visualize what a young Gordy would go through, and then she took it to the next stage with her illustrations.
And this story he wrote about himself in his own book, which is what twigged you in the first place.
Yes, his autobiography. And he told it later in life when he would go to hockey legends, luncheons, et cetera, et cetera. He spoke with fondness about his mother, and deservedly so. And there are a lot of lessons that kids can take out of this. First one is perseverance.
Yeah.
You want to be good at anything, whether it's a sport, playing an instrument, or even being a writer, you have to work at it. It takes work, it takes time, it takes dedication. The book's also about kindness, a mother's kindness. It's about helping one another in times of need. We're all in this together.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that too is literacy. In Saskatchewan, 1 in 3 people struggle with some form of literacy, whether it be reading a bank statement or a restaurant menu, et cetera, et cetera. And so my hope through this book is that it will encourage more kids to read more. Reading to me is a superpower.
Yeah,
and it's
it
a
truly
superpower
is.
to take you places. So that's another purpose behind the book.
I'm very grateful for that because my parents encouraged that. I mean, I grew up in the pre-TV days, or at least we couldn't afford a TV. And so reading was that flight to some other place that you could not even imagine.
That's right. It can take you places and enable you to do things that, you can excel through reading, whatever you choose to do. Yeah.
You didn't really have to find Gordy's voice because this isn't told from his perspective. It is just a story, but you have to speak to young children, and that's different voice that you have to find from the academic who tells the story of history.
Yeah. Yes. I don't consider myself, though, an academic writer. I write for a general audience, and I've been a trade publisher. So, but you do need to make sure it's engaging and entertaining. You have to hook the reader, whatever age that reader is. And that's why I opened the story with the fall and the coming of those first few snowflakes, and Gordy thinking about hockey and getting on the ice. And you've got to capture those young imaginations so they can visualize it themselves.
It conjures up, of course, and age and stage, and we may share that to some degree. This was a time when kids were sent out. I certainly was, and you played outside all day. You came home at dark.
I agree.
That was it.
That's right. And the other thing you could add to what you said, Miss Wallen, is that it didn't matter what the score was at the end of the day. It was that you were out and you had a great time, and you were out to go the next day. And I too remember having to come home when it got dark, or coming home for meals.
Yes.
And
I definitely showed up for meals.
Meals, that's right. But you're right. You grew up on the street, but the streets were a place of fun, and it's good fun. And that's what Gordy and his friends did. It didn't matter whether they had the best equipment. Sure, it's old equipment. Sure, it might be down equipment, but they're out having good fun and making good memories.
Yeah. And it does conjure up a time, and please call me Pamela, by the way, because you write about this period, about the 30s, and that was, and I think this is your phrase, it was the great leveler.
Yes,
Everybody was poor.
everybody suffered. That's right. It is the great leveler, and that's the common denominator about these years. And my parents were products of that generation. My father turned 18 in 1931. My mom was 15. And had an indelible impact on them in the 1930s, and then war. My father was 40 when I was born. My father had an entire lifetime before him. And I always had older parents, but the values were instilled in me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was the time as well between the two wars,
Yeah.
and of course you've written about that, but there were huge losses in World War One,
Yeah.
and that would have changed the dynamic. I mean, there were a lot of pioneers came. My grandmother homesteaded in the south of Saskatchewan at the turn of the, into the 1900s. Beginning there, like this was it was a time in our lives when people needed family, and the families were different because so many of the men were lost.
That's right. And people are trying to make sense of what happened to the world. The world that Canada went to fight and save in 1914 was not the world that Canadian soldiers came home to in 1918. Things had changed fundamentally. And in the 1920s, people in Canada and Saskatchewan in particular are trying to adjust to that change. And people don't always like change.
Right.
And yes, there was protest against some of that change, but there's fundamental change in the 1920s and 1930s. I think the thing about the 1930s, because everybody's suffering, up until the 1930s, there was the belief that a healthy person without a job was lazy. There was always work to be had.
Yeah.
But in the 1930s, that was proven to be false. And people had to learn to put their pride in their pockets, because going on relief was a sign of failure in the early 1930s. But people had to learn to put their pride in their pockets and ask for help that they normally wouldn't do. And people and governments and society came to play a bigger role in people's lives in the 1930s to help us get through that decade.
And the rise of the CCF, and it, I mean, politically, it had
politically,
huge
it's a time of great change. Even traditional parties, liberals, conservatives, they adjust. The conservatives became progressive conservatives in 1943 in response to the changes that Canadian society is going through. The liberals move leftward to a degree to try and stem the challenge from the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. But it's a time of political turmoil, new ideas, new solutions. It's a cauldron when you think of it, of different ideas and responses to events. There's a fear of outside forces, a fear of communism in the 1930s, and that people thinking in the 1930s that the system is failing them. So should we look at other systems of government? And that was a fear in the 1930s. In fact, the irony is that Canadians were so focused on the fear of communism in the 1930s. Along comes 1939. It's the fascists we really had to worry about and what they were doing in Europe.
Yeah. Not the communists.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this province was also developing and would go on, as I learned in public school, to become the breadbasket of the world.
Yeah. But that became a
pretty
problem.
Bleak in the 30s, the 20s, and the 30s.
Yeah, and if we can segue there into my book, Saskatchewan, A New History, I wrote that for the 2005 Provincial Centennial. And it looks at the first 100 years of Saskatchewan's history. And the overarching theme is that in 1905, the blueprint for Saskatchewan was one dominant culture, Anglo-Canadian. Anglo-Canadians matter. And one dominant activity, agriculture. And one dominant region, the southern half of the province. A former provincial cabinet minister called Northern Saskatchewan another country altogether. We rarely thought of Northern Saskatchewan, and yet the geographic center of Saskatchewan is 100 miles north of Prince Albert.
Yes, exactly.
People don't
way
think
north of where I sit today as well.
But that blueprint from 1905 is challenged in part by the new immigrants. They were seen as a threat to Saskatchewan, and yet come the 1930s. That great level of the 1930s, they are part of Saskatchewan. They are our future. When you think of people like Romano, Natishin, Sylvia Fedoruk, or Beta, there are four prominent Ukrainian names from Saskatchewan's past and in the early 1990s. Who are they? One's the Chancellor of the University of Saskatchewan and Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan. One's the head of the Court of Appeal. One's the Governor General. One's the Premier of Saskatchewan. That would have been unthinkable in the early 20th century because we didn't want this different culture. Yes, we wanted these people, but they had to leave their baggage behind at the border when they arrived.
Was kind of, I guess it goes to that very fundamental thing, and we see it in the US, which is the melting pot versus the mosaic, which is Canada. And people did integrate. They kept to their communities initially, but as you say, through the 30s, when everybody was suffering, there was no time for that kind of I'm better than you or the implicit racism.
That's right. And by the end of the 1930s, Saskatchewan is no longer attracting the immigrants it once did a generation earlier. And so by the 1940s, we have the largest provincial-born population, whereas a generation or two earlier, we had the most out-of-province-born population. And that's what shifts. And with that shifts comes an acceptance of these people from continental Europe and other places. I like to say that Giezerowski, as much as Saskatchewan name is as Wallen.
Yes, exactly. Well, I go back to the Swedes, but no, it's really true because it does. It maybe forced that embracing of somebody that was different.
That's right, but it took a while because we don't adopt that provincial model from many people's strength until 1971. That late. We fought diversity through the 20s and 30s. It wasn't until World War II and after that we accept that. Do you know who our first Catholic premier in Saskatchewan was?
No.
Grant Devine.
Oh my
It took until 1982 because of that resistance to continental European immigrants and Catholic immigrants. There was an anti-Catholic element to Saskatchewan society in the early 20th century. It takes a while. But the other part of that blueprint I talked about was agriculture, as you said, and agriculture gets walloped, as you know, in the 1930s. Not only is it ecological challenges, but record low wheat prices and other grain prices. So what happens after the 1930s, 1940s is the diversification. And as you know, Saskatchewan today exports the largest number of products of any other province in Canada in terms of resources.
You know, I've just been listening to that over the last couple of weeks with the port strike and the people walking off the job. How much of that, like 40% of what goes out of the Port of Vancouver, comes from the province of Saskatchewan?
That's right. And that's how we adjusted that blueprint. So now we have a much more diversified economy. It's still vulnerable, though, because it depends on world demand and world prices, but it is much more diversified. And the recent forecasting is that Saskatchewan will weather the upcoming recession, if it does happen, better than many provinces because of that diverse resource base we have here in terms of the trade we do. And the third part of that blueprint is that how we used to ignore northern Saskatchewan. Well, northern Saskatchewan is an integral part of the provincial economy today, which it wasn't a century ago. So that blueprint's been turned on its head.
Yeah, and even more so, I don't know what you make of whether or not we're going to be a large supplier of critical minerals, but there's a belief here that we are going to at least help supply some of that as we transition through energy changes.
That's right. And so, as I said, it's quite remarkable, the change.
Yeah.
Many people are stunned to learn that agriculture contributes less than 10% to our provincial economy today.
In Saskatchewan, I'm shocked to learn that.
It's 10% only, but because of all the other economic activity. And so we have a province that's identified with wheat fields, grain elevators, et cetera, but we're quite a different place. We're not, in the national consciousness, we're a place that time forgot because we never change our clocks, but we are fundamentally different than we once were.
And mostly that's energy related, is what you're saying?
energy related and mining and things like that, and biotech and
Yeah.
other activities. So it is quite interesting. We still have challenges, though. To be quite frank, the place of our indigenous population.
Yeah.
And we have significant challenges there that we need to address because they are in many ways our future.
You've written about this extensively, and you've got a new book coming out in the fall.
Yes.
Called Cheated, the Laurier Liberals and the Theft of First Nations Reserve Land.
Yeah.
What brought you to that?
Well, it's well, to be quite frank, I've done some work in reserve surrenders in the past, just individual ones. But I wanted to look at the larger story because under the previous Conservative administration in the late 19th century, I'm talking about MacDonald and his successors, there was only one reserve surrender in Western Canada from 1876 until 1896. During a 20-year period when the legislation's in place, only one reserve surrender takes place. After 1896, when the Laurier Liberals come to power, there are dozens of them. In fact, prairie reserves are reduced by 21% in terms of their area. 1 in 5 acres is taken away from prairie First Nations, from the reserves. And the standard argument is that this land was needed for agriculture. There are so many settlers moving in that we need to take this reserve land away for settlers. That didn't happen. What Cheated explains is that a group of liberal insiders, whether they be civil servants or politicians, looked upon reserve land as an opportunity to make money. And Cheated documents how liberal insiders use their influence and liberal politicians to reduce reserves, take reserve land away from First Nations, and benefit from it personally. It's not for settlers. Yeah.
Well, that's a really important point in the current discussion today as well of the conflict between those called settlers and the Indigenous people. But it strikes me because we're talking about taking John A. Macdonald's name off everything, and there's even the major roadway in Ottawa. His name's being taken off because of so-called racist past, and you're saying actually because you don't hear that about Laurier. You see buildings and roads and streets still named.
For me, my job as an historian is not to blame, but to explain.
To explain, exactly.
I wanted to explain why things happen a particular way. And part of explaining why things happen a particular way is to understand that people are products of their time. I'm not excusing their behavior, but they're prisoners of their time. And we cannot simply take modern values and apply them to the past. That's doing history backwards. We need to understand we need to understand the attitudes and motivations. And by understanding those attitudes and motivations, I think we would have a better informed debate today.
Well, as you've just noted, this was not about stealing the land to give to the settlers. There was what would have been the Indigenous population in that time in the area called Saskatchewan? How many
in
people?
Saskatchewan? You're talking about 4,000 to 5,000.
So that's not enough people to develop this land, and so
the point is that they had very little land. When you look at the agricultural land available in Saskatchewan, they have very little land. They are limited in terms of how they can develop that land. First Nations were not initially allowed machinery. They had to use hand tools. They're restricted in many ways. And the conclusion was by the late 19th, early 20th century, they're not meant to be farmers. Well, the truth of the matter is that they're handcuffed in terms of what they can do. They cannot sell their produce without a permit, the permit system, et cetera, et cetera. So they really are handcuffed in terms of how they can prosper at agriculture.
I mean, it's right here where I sit on Fishing Lake. At the end of this lake is a First Nation. And that's some of the worst farmland in the area. We've got a lot of good farmland, but they don't have it.
Yeah, well, some of that Fishing Lake farmland was removed.
Yeah.
And so, but the point of Cheated is that They believed that First Nations shouldn't have this land. They had too much land, etc., even though it's a treaty promise. It was a treaty promise during the 1870s that these reserves would be inviolate. They would be theirs forever. And yet within a generation, they're looking at ways of taking reserve land away. So there's an irony here. The Macdonald Conservatives wanted First Nations settled on reserves. The Laurier Liberals wanted to remove reserve land.
And for personal benefit, which is not a great story.
That's right.
So in terms of that, because you've written other bits of this, I'm just trying to see where the transition occurred. This was, and everybody understood that this place, this area, was, you know, a rural society, and we didn't anticipate any large cities like Toronto, and we still don't really have them.
Well,
you know, go ahead.
The transition takes place in the 1880s. Okay. And I talked about this in my book, A World We Have Lost, Saskatchewan Before 1905. Up until the 1880s, we had an Indigenous, non-Indigenous population that got along. They had to get along, okay? If you look at the census from the 1880s, the number of official marriages between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people was around 80%.
Wow.
It's
hence the Métis population. Yeah.
Métis population, or even when I say Indigenous, I include Métis. But I'm not saying that there weren't problems or challenges between the Indigenous, non-Indigenous population, but we got along. Yeah. Okay. We learned to work together. Okay. And come 1885 in the Northwest Rebellion, after that, there's the belief that Métis and First Nations people can't be trusted. There's an increased emphasis on whiteness in Western Canada. Prince Albert, up until the 1880s, was a Métis community. Yeah. After 1885, it's regarded as a white community. The emphasis on whiteness. So if you were an Indigenous person after 1885, if you're Métis, you're expected to integrate or move to the margins of society. If you're a First Nations people, you were expected to disappear eventually. You were not part of our future after the 1880s. And that's part of that original blueprint from the creation of Saskatchewan. But they didn't disappear. They are part of our future today, an integral part of our future.
Right. And that's direction from Ottawa,
Ottawa and the settlers too. The emphasis on Anglo-Canadian society. We wanted, Saskatchewan people wanted to create this into a powerful prairie province based on agriculture. Agriculture was to be the engine of our economy. Some of the fastest growing cities in Canada were in Saskatchewan. Saskatoon, for example, in 1901 had a population of 113. By 1911, it's got 12,000. 113.
We're actually the most populous province at one point, which
that's right,
and astounding.
We were the third most populous province in the 1920s, after Ontario and Quebec. We were larger than BC, even by 1926.
Because you hear a lot of that discussion today, and the creation of the Buffalo Party, that there was this big area, Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the Fathers of Confederation and those in power in Ottawa didn't want that huge political counterweight.
That's right. Did not want that. Haltane, who was our first territorial premier that brought the region into Confederation and dealings with the Laurier government, he wanted one large Western province to be called Buffalo. And he wanted a large Western province that would not simply be dependent on agriculture, but other resources. And he had a vision for a great Western province. But the powers that be in 1905 did not want one large Western province. They were afraid it would upset the balance of Confederation. So you got two roughly north-south provinces of equal size, Saskatchewan and Alberta. And what many Canadians don't realize is that when Saskatchewan and Alberta became provinces in 1905, we weren't equal provinces. We were denied control of our public lands and resources. Yeah. They were still controlled by Ottawa. And we don't get control of them until 1930. So if you're wondering
and we're still fighting that
fight. Yeah, so if you're wondering why in Saskatchewan, Alan Blakeney was so concerned about resource control and taxation, or Bradwell on potash. It's because of this historical grievance. We were treated unlike all other provinces up until
Well, and
19.
I still think that feeling is there here too, which is they didn't want us to be powerful, and that takes different expressions today. But if you're from Saskatchewan, you still feel that it's kind of in your blood as you're born and bred.
Yes, but the other irony here is that Saskatchewan used to be a liberal province
Yes, for sure.
100 years ago.
Yeah.
We had successive liberal provincial governments from 1905 to 29. We had two liberal premiers that went on to serve in the federal government. The longest serving agricultural minister in Canadian history, Jimmy Gardiner.
Yeah.
Former Saskatchewan premier. Mackenzie King, our longest serving prime minister, he represented the riding of Prince Albert for almost 2 decades. So there was this Ottawa, Regina, or Ottawa, Saskatchewan connection we've moved away from. But I think part of that is get back to where we started this discussion on Gordy's Skate, was the 1930s. A lot of people in the 1930s wrote off Saskatchewan because of the devastation from the Depression and the drought. We would never realize our potential.
How did we come back?
How did we come back? I think we came back by vibrant political activity. And you're not just talking about Tommy Douglas.
Yeah.
Think of John Diefenbaker.
Yeah.
You've got Jimmy Gardiner. It's an intense political atmosphere, pushing ideas, pushing solutions, trying to find the best way forward. I think it's adjusting to the circumstances in terms of our economy, how we reshaped our economy, revised our economy. We're still facing challenges, but you've got a lot of newcomers in Saskatchewan today that are changing the makeup of this province and really turning that Anglo-Canadian blueprint on its head. But the downside of all this, Pamela, is how many of these people, new Canadians, are being treated and received in Saskatchewan. And I say that because still today because there are people of color, people of different religions. And today, some people in Saskatchewan are saying things about these new immigrants that were ironically said about Ukrainians and other continental European immigrants a century ago.
Yeah.
And what I like to remind people, they've come here today for a better life for themselves, and if not themselves, their children and their children's children. And they've come here for better opportunity and a better future. And I know that because I serve as a presiding official at citizenship ceremonies. And by all means, let's keep in-person.
Yes, I was just going to say, now you've really set one off in me, because canceling those ceremonies is driving me crazy.
But the point is that at these ceremonies, when I talk to people, I hear their stories, what brought them to Canada, their hopes and their dreams, and we all have stories.
Yeah.
And it's that opportunity. Gordy got that opportunity through a pair of skates. Why can't new immigrants to Saskatchewan get similar kinds of opportunities to use their skills and their expertise and the potential of the best of their ability?
What do you think that's about? Because you see today, I see the embrace of, because there's such a large diaspora, obviously, but Ukrainians coming here, they're being brought into small communities. People are reaching out as Gordy's mother did, helping the neighbor. They're finding them a place to live. They're bringing food and furniture and helping them get settled. So I see that as a very strong force. Maybe it's rural versus urban. I don't know.
Well, I have a very simple explanation.
Okay.
We're all in this together. I mean that sincerely. We're all in this together. And we have to learn to work together, to listen to one another, and find a way forward collectively. The same thing applies to reconciliation.
Right.
We need to have some hard conversations, but we also have to talk about finding our way forward together. So
where are you on that issue? Are you an optimist? I think a lot of people are struggling with what reconciliation means. when will we have achieved it? Can we ever? Is it just a process, not an end spot? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just a very difficult conversation.
It's very difficult. What I tell my friends, and I've had these conversations with friends here in Saskatoon, is that we need to talk to one another. That's the best place to start, and to listen to one another.
Yeah.
And when I say to listen to one another, we have told Indigenous people for almost 100 years what to do.
Mm-hmm.
We like to tell them what to do because we know what's best. Well, we don't necessarily know what's best. And we need to talk and start having conversations together. I think the new Governor General said that reconciliation is getting to know one another. She said that in her acceptance speech when she was named Governor General, getting to know one another. And that's part and parcel of my line. We're all in this together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a process for sure.
Yeah.
Bill Waiser, thank you so much for this snapshot of not only my own province, but this great story about Gordie Howe, who we all claim and we love to talk about our heroes. And just remember that his roots were as troubled as many people experienced in the 30s, and it's about the values that you figure out from family in your community that change history.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
That's great. So if you have kids in your life, go and find a copy of this, Gordie's Skate. It's a great story, and I think you don't have to be a hockey player to even appreciate it. I think it could be.
What I do, Pamela, at my book launch is I call up grandparents to read from it. And they love it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's also something that the older generation knows about, and it's an opportunity to tell stories to the next gens on down. Right?
Exactly. So and that's how we make those connections, through story.
For sure. Bill Waiser, academic, Order of Canada, Saskatchewan Order of Merit, 2 Governor General's Awards. I could go on and on. But perhaps being a grandfather of 6 helps you figure out how.
Thank you. And the seal of approval for Gordie's Skate came from my Australian grandson who plays cricket.
Oh, really?
But he loved the book. So if it resonated with Isaac, it will resonate with Canadian kids.
In Australia, for sure. That's great. Thanks so much, Bill.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll talk again.
Okay. Take care. Cheers. Bye.
And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you again soon.